welcome to this RFL New Year's Special 2015 A Look Back. Now, in this hour, we will take a look back at the biggest stories of the year in politics, news, the top stories in our region, as well as sports, and also what may have been the biggest story of 2015, the year in guns and gun violence. Now, to help us put the year in perspective, we've got a special and very well-dressed panel. At our table here, Jeannie Zaino, of course, professor of political science at Iona College and professor of campaign management at NYU, resplendent in blue. Dominic Carter here, political journalist and author. Look at stats. TJ McCormick with the dash of color, Republican consultant, and Andrew Whitman. We're not going to make dinner jacket jokes here, our senior political correspondent. And since RFL is a political show, let's start there with a look at politics this past year and a look, as we see now, how many of the headlines you very well remember.
My friends, I'm deeply humbled by the opportunity to speak for a third time before the most important legislative body in the world, the U.S. Congress.
Looking back, it would have been better if I'd simply used a second email account and carried a second phone, but at the time, this didn't seem like an issue.
With a firestorm brewing over Indiana's new Religious Freedom Act, the man in the middle, Governor Mike Pence, coming forward today to defend the law in an interview with our own George Stephanopoulos.
We're not going to change the law, okay? But if the General Assembly in Indiana sends me a bill that adds a section and clarifies what the law really is, then I'm open to that.
A Supreme Court ruling announced minutes ago upholds a key portion of the Affordable Care Act in much of the country. The 6-3 ruling finds that the federal government's Obamacare exchange can offer subsidies to insurance buyers who qualify for lower rates.
Historic ruling here. For the first time, the Supreme Court has said there is a constitutional right excuse me, to same-sex marriage. You can hear the cheer in the crowd. A very dramatic moment here, a 5-4 decision written by Justice Anthony Kennedy. This is a total victory for the advocates of same-sex marriage.
To reignite the promise of America. And that is why
I announce, with God's help,
I'm running for president.
I announce my candidacy for president of the United States.
It is just the place to be in the campaign that begins today.
Ceremony is just starting at the State House in Columbia, South Carolina. Governor Nikki Haley and state officials there will remove the Confederate battle flag from a monument just outside the building. The controversial banner has flown at the State House for more than 50 years.
I am most grateful for the invitation to address this joint session of Congress in the land of the free at the home of the brave.
This morning, I informed my colleagues that I would resign from the speakership and resign from Congress at the end of October.
It is deeply unfortunate that something as serious as what happened in Benghazi could ever be used for partisan political purposes.
The Honorable Paul D. Ryan of the state of Wisconsin, having received a majority of the votes cast, is duly elected as Speaker of the House.
Because when you're up here, you see it so clearly. Wherever you come from, whatever you believe, we are all in the same boat.
More than a dozen Republican governors and one Democrat now refusing to accept any refugees from Syria, in some cases until after a security review.
Tonight, I want to talk with you about this tragedy, the broader threat of terrorism, and how we can keep our country safe.
All right. You know, one of the things, at least for me, Jeannie, was if possible, we went from such a divisive Washington at the beginning of the year to ending it with it even more dismissive and divisive than I think we've seen, if that was even possible. Even a visit by the Pope became controversial. And I think you could see that thread, whether it be Benghazi or emails, then Syria and everything else in between. It was an ugly year in politics.
It was really an ugly year, and you know, it's the one thing they got done was maybe this new Education Act, which was just passed in December, but beyond that, it's hard to point to one single piece of important policy that was passed in Washington, D.C. without an enormous fight. People are just fed up with Washington.
You know, in a lot of ways, Dominic, it could have been even worse if the Supreme Court, whether it be on gay marriage or Obamacare, decided to throw one out or continue to make it a state issue. In many ways, they took that off the plate of Congress. I mean, just imagine if either one of those went the other way.
Well, certainly, Richard, the Supreme Court threw, if you will, President Obama a lifeline. And he went from talk of being, going into lame duck to being a very active president, wrapping down the final last couple of years. The Supreme Court has been very interesting in terms of not much play out of Washington, but decisions came down impacting all of America from the Supreme Court. And it'll be interesting to see as we go into the final year of Obama what he exactly does.
What stood out for you?
I think, look, we've heard a lot about the permanent campaign culture that sort of gripped the country, but I think it's impacting our politics on every single level now. One of the reasons why nothing was able to get done in Washington this year is because everybody was already positioned for 2016, and not just Democrats versus Republicans, but a lot of Republicans afraid to break with their party for fear of a primary challenge, or Democrats also sticking to the orthodoxy, as it were, and figuring out where the party is right now. I think we've entered a dangerous period of this permanent campaign where you never get a period to legislate anymore. You never get a period to get anything done because everybody's always focused on what's coming next. We've seen signs of this, but I don't know if it's crippled us and crippled our political system quite as much as we saw in 2015.
You know, for Republicans, it was a seismic last few years. This year, no different. I mean, you think about whether it's called the Tea Party or the Freedom Caucus or whatever, it drove out a speaker in the House and it brought a new one in. And obviously, with 2016 hanging over everybody's head, not just on the presidential side, but what happens down ticket if a Trump or somebody else, and we'll talk more about that as the show goes on. But this is a real uncertain time, I would think, for Republicans.
A real uncertain time for Republican establishment, because you know the Tea Party is now an afterthought. Interestingly enough, because Paul Ryan you wouldn't necessarily link to the Tea Party, and some people are saying it's the year of the outsider with Donald Trump coming to the fore, and at the same time that Tea Party now is knocking on the door with Ted Cruz making a move.
Absolutely, and we're going to be talking a lot more about what lies ahead in the following year, but also international politics. Who thought that would have been the driving issue potentially in an election, but it very well may be. All right, we're going to take a first break. But on the other side of it, the year in news and news headlines, from the heartbreak and tragic to the faith-inspiring and heartwarming. Please stay with us.